Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Malcolm Harkins. I'm Chief Security and Trust Officer with Silence Corporation. What I wanted to do before I jump into this a little bit more was give you a little bit about my background, because it tends to frame how I think and approach certain things. And this discussion is around trust and the economics in the age of information security. I'm a little bit of a non-traditional Chief Security and Trust Officer, given my background. And internally at Silence, I'm responsible for our internal risk, security controls, and compliance activity. And I've been doing that for 2.5 years, give or take a little bit. Prior to that, I spent almost 24 years with Intel Corporation. And my last role there was Worldwide Chief Security and Privacy Officer, where I had responsibility for corporate emergency management, traditional IT and information risk and security, all the privacy for the organization, but also product security, not the features for sale, but trying to make sure that Intel's technology and services did not have vulnerabilities. But before I found my way into security, I had started in a different role. I have an undergraduate in economics and an MBA in finance and accounting, and had spent the first 10, 11 years of my career at Intel in various business roles, procurement, finance, business operations. So I have a business background and a business acumen that I've brought to the security space for a number of years. So again, with that as a little bit of framing, let me dive into this in a little bit more detail here. We have a trust issue in the world. Organizations are becoming less trusted by consumers. Governments are becoming less trusted by consumers. And broadly speaking, I think we can easily just look at the news headlines day in and day out and say we have a trust issue with everybody being able to trust that their information assets, physically or logically, are well protected. And when I think of trust distills into two broad macro concepts. You trust somebody or an organization based upon their competencies, the capabilities they have, the results they deliver, and then you trust based upon the character, what's the intent and the integrity. And I would suggest that, broadly speaking, what we've been doing from a security perspective can't be trusted, because if it were able to be trusted, we would see the real results of this. And instead of the explosion of risk, we would have pockets of risk. We'd have pockets of areas where we could do better, but instead we have significant vulnerabilities, significant security solutions and controls that don't effectively work. And then on the character side, I'll explain this a little bit further as we go into it. But before I dive into it a little bit further, I'll just leave you with this one tidbit. The security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. So economically speaking, the vast majority of the security industry has no economic incentive to solve the problem. So when you think of the intent of many of the players who sell you solutions, you need to think about that and whether or not they have your best interest at heart. This brings me to this next item. I do a lot of speaking at various events. I spend a ton of time with peers, literally hundreds and hundreds every year. I was on a panel in May of this year in Los Angeles, and the panel was made up of a group of CISOs. And during the Q&A section, one of the participants in the panel had gotten asked a question around how they dealt with certain things and what the real challenge was. And in their concluding statement to the question, they made this comment, except that they're going to get in. I took umbrage to that statement, and after they were done, basically explained that this was accepting the equivalent of digital assault. This was basically saying, I'm not going to do my best to manage and mitigate risk. I'm just going to roll over and accept that my organization is going to be compromised, and I'm not going to do my hardest to try and mitigate that. And the thing that made it more appalling for me was the CISO worked for a security company focused on identity management, authentication, and authorization. So basically managing the process and controls for other organizations to know that the equivalent of Malcolm is Malcolm and manage what he was accessing. And I said, basically, you've said as the security person responsible for protecting the security company, your company cannot protect the identities that you're being paid to manage to protect your end customer. And this is the sorry state we're in. I think we've gotten to the point that we accept the compromise. We accept the compromise because we've got such lousy solutions deployed in our environment, because they have failed to manage and mitigate the risks. And we also accept the compromise because, again, the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing, and they want us to accept that they're going to get in. I'll explain a little bit more about that. In February of this year, the RSA conference, and I'm sure many of you have either attended or at least familiar with it, I had walked into the Moscone West location where the registration was on Monday morning about 6:45 a.m. And as I register and I exit the building, I see these 4 big billboards that are probably 40 feet long and 25 feet wide, spread across the Moscone North location. The moment you link business risk to a security incident, that's business-driven security. I was so outraged by this statement that I went up on the balcony, took a picture of it, and I've used it in a number of talks since then. Having managed information risk and security now for the better part of 16, going on 17 years, this is not business-driven security. This is reaction and response. It doesn't take much acumen for anybody to link an incident of any significance to the business. This is perpetuating the myth and the message that most of the security industry wants us to believe, that reaction is the way to run our businesses. But that's not business-driven security. Business-driven security is about understanding the mission of your organization and doing your darndest to help manage and mitigate the risk so that mission can be successful. The only way in which this is business-driven security is from the security industry, who profits from the insecurity of computing. Then it drives their business. But you got to look at it and go, what does my organization need? What do my customers need, internally and externally, and how do I enable them to achieve their mission while managing the risk? It's about being upfront, proactive, preventative, and if and only if the risk manifests itself, respond and recover from it. Today's reality is we're firefighting. And again, for a variety of reasons, I'll explain some of it further. Some data here on today's reality. The Information Systems Security Association, through their eyes of the security professionals, they publish this occasionally. This one was from about 10, 11 months ago, where they surveyed security professionals in a variety of different organizations. The basic summary was half of us believe we're significantly vulnerable. The other half believe we're somewhat vulnerable, which basically means we all think we're vulnerable to substantial risk that could affect our organizations. The World Economic Forum, for those of you that track it, I look at it pretty detailed every year. Their report for their risk report that came out in February of this year just as the World Economic Forum was starting, that talked about technology as both a source of disruption as well as polarization. So again, given the social, economic divides and the things that we're seeing worldwide, technology is helping foster some of that divisiveness. And in the top 5 risk trends, you can see them here. Cyber dependence, coupled in the group of the top 5 risks for the world across 140, 150 different nations, different economic and social spectrums, different educational background of the people that they've surveyed. Cyber dependence is up there with aging population, climate change, income and wealth disparities. We've crossed the tipping point where anything and everything with power is becoming IP addressable. And our dependence on cyber is growing, which means that the risk curves that we see today, if they continue forward into the broad Internet of Things and that dependency grows, we will have more and more true life-altering consequences for security and privacy done wrong. Some more detail on today's reality. The Edelman Trust Report, again, that comes out about the same time as the World Economic Forum occurs. It's been going on 15, 16, 17 years. And this year's report says there's been an implosion of trust. 2/3 of the world are distrusters of others, either as individuals with organizations, individuals with governments, or organization to organization, and that we're in treacherous seas without a firm mooring. Now, this is meant for the broad risk issues and societal issues, but I also think it's true when we get into the cyber risk space. Europol does an internet crime report every year in about October. The recent one just got published back a week or so ago. I haven't updated this, but it's, again, similar summaries in it. They've seen an acceleration of previous trends. So when they go look at all of the internet crime that they've investigated and aggregate the trends, they're saying that the previous trends of the risk curves continue to grow and accelerate. I think, again, we all see it in the news every day. Other summaries: advanced persistent threats and cyber crime boundaries blur. And it's interesting, I've long believed this myself, that the motivations might differ, but the tools, the tradecraft, the approach that the bad guys use to get into organizations or to affect a consumer are by and large the same. And their data indicates the same thing. And then the other thing that's surprising for many, but not necessarily for me, given what I've seen, is that their conclusion is the majority of attacks are neither sophisticated or advanced. And if that's a conclusion from the investigation of all these cyber crimes across all the nations in Europe, why is it that when we pick up a newspaper and there's a breach, somebody goes, a sophisticated actor, an advanced attack? In reality, the details say they're not that advanced. It's the sloppiness we have in managing the environment, and it's frankly the crappy security solutions we have deployed in our environments that don't work. Even further to this point on these things being neither sophisticated or advanced, Joyce, who runs cybersecurity now at the White House in the United States, he formerly ran what was called the ATO, basically the organization that was the cyber offensive arm for the United States under the NSA. And he gave a talk a little over a year ago. You can find it on YouTube. And he basically said, as the nation state attacker and the person who runs that organization, they don't use 0 days. They don't have to. And basically said that it's because they can get past existing security solutions fairly easily, and they can get past because of the sloppiness and how we manage the infrastructures in our own organizations. So they very rarely have to use them, which again further supports that these things aren't all that advanced. It's a rinse, repeat, recycle that's been going on by not only nation states, but organized crime and other cyber adversaries, because they don't have to work that hard. And that's the state that we're in. Being a former finance guy and somebody that has more of a traditional business background, when I was working on my second book, I had continued to get frustrated with the marketing manipulations and messages coming from the industry, like I had shared with you a little bit earlier. And I found that people just don't understand the basics. So I went back to the basics and say, how can you manage risk? I think we know this intuitively, but I tried to put it into a framework that allows not only the security professional to step out of the weeds, but also to have a dialogue with their management around this. There's three macro ways we can control for risk. You can prevent it, detect it, respond to it. I think we all know that. And risk grows as you go from prevention to response. Because as you're detecting and responding, that means bad things are already occurring. And the macro measurements that you can play with when you're reacting and responding are time to detect and time to contain. Because detection and response are damage minimization controls. You're minimizing damage. Prevention is the only true form of reduction in the potential for harm. Removal of potential vulnerabilities to, again, stop the cycle of risk from occurring. And then there's three macro ways that you can approach these controls. You can do them in an automated fashion, semi-automated, and manual. Cost grows as you go from an automated solution into a manual solution. And so when you build this out, you look at it and you go, okay, the highest risk, highest cost, most liability for our organizations is in that square here in the middle to upper right. And the lowest risk, lowest cost, and lowest liability is in the lower left. Now, there's a third dimension to this, which is that element down at the bottom left called control friction. I just can't draw well enough to do a three-dimensional box. But controls are also a drag coefficient on people, data, and process. They chew up CPU cycles. They get in the way of a user trying to do their job. And as risk and control and security professionals, we don't do a good job managing that friction. And in fact, in many ways, we don't care about it because we've been measured on trying to manage risk. And so we throw obstacles in front of the users. Just think of how many users in your organization, whether they be end users or management, praise the security solution for helping them achieve their job, or do they moan and groan about the security solutions getting in their way and, in essence, destroying their computing experience? So we've got to think about that third dimension of control friction as we look for solutions, as well as when we design and deploy controls in our environment. Now, most of the industry, if you look at your organizations and you think about the time spent, the money spent, where your resources are primarily in that upper right quadrant. And that's because of the reaction and response. That's because the solutions we've got deployed don't work. And so therefore, we end up in this upper right quadrant. Now, again, going back to my view that the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing, if this is the highest cost for us, this is the most revenue for the industry. Getting back to my view that the industry itself, by and large, the vast majority of the players have no economic incentive to truly solve the problem. So it's up to us to stand up and demand of ourselves, our teams, our organizations, and the industry to deliver on three things: a demonstrable and sustainable bend in the curve of risk, something that will allow me to lower and flatten my total cost of controls, and solutions that also reduce and remove control friction on the business and on the user. If we do this, we can make some changes. You know, today's reality is we're inefficient. Information security is an economic inefficiency. And let me explain why that's the case. But to do that, I have to start with explaining what is an economic efficiency. Economic efficiency is about where every resource is optimally allocated to serve while minimizing waste. The ideal state is the welfare of the population and the highest level of welfare possible. So if that's the definition of economic efficiency, I think it's easy to come to the conclusion that information security is economically inefficient, because we are not at the highest welfare level possible. We are not minimizing waste, and we are not optimally allocated to serve our organizations. If we were, we wouldn't be having breach after breach after breach, and we wouldn't be having our users and our business complain about the security solutions that get in their way. Again, it's not necessarily information security that is the problem. It's our approach to it that's the cause of the economic inefficiency. You know, today's reality, in conclusion, I think we can all agree that we're not resistant to, nor are we resilient from cyber risk. The data shows that. We see it day in and day out. I know we all experience it. It's up to us to change that. Simply put, the threat actors have had a temporal advantage over us. You know, computing has been growing exponentially for years. The devices, the applications, the growth of information assets physically, logically, their usage models have been growing at an exponential rate. We've been approaching risk more likely at a linear rate. Hence, if you were to graph that, you would have a difference between an exponential curve and a linear curve and a risk gap, putting the attackers with having a time advantage over us because we've lagged the rest of computing. We've lagged the advances that have been going on with the right security approach, the right security tools to do what I call protect to enable the business. And instead, we've gotten in the way and we've deployed solutions that haven't kept up. Another data point, Piper Jaffray publishes a breacher report a few times a year. They've shown a 74.1% correlation between breach activity and security industry revenue growth. Again, getting to my view that the security industry, by and large, profits from the insecurity of computing. Shame on us for growing the revenue and buying more solutions that don't work when breaches occur. Again, security industry profiting from the insecurity of computing. Some more details to prove this. The WannaCry attacks from earlier this year, both from the Guardian and Fortune publications. Cyber stocks boom after ransomware attacks. The market capitalization of the biggest cybersecurity companies rose by billions. So they're the ones who sold us solutions that didn't work. And we're reacting and responding, having to spend more money, more effort, having harm to our organization, harm to our customers, harm to our shareholders, and the security industry who sold us the solutions that didn't work, their shareholders benefit and their revenues raise. How stupid are we to allow this to occur? Again, as somebody with an economic background, I tend to look at a variety of different economic reports. Harvard puts out every year or so a state of the US competitiveness. And I had gone through this earlier this year and pulled out some tidbits that I thought were interesting. And their conclusions were America's economic challenges are structural. There's a level of political rhetoric and uninformed national debate that have confused the average American. And that confusion is a serious obstacle to America's ability to make progress. And I highlight these because I think they have correlation to information security. I think our challenges from a cybersecurity perspective are structural. They're structural in how we've approached it, hence why I'm adamant about people thinking about my 9-box and having the right control philosophy. I think the rhetoric and confusion that the security industry causes, again, confuses our management, confuses the average consumer. And that also makes it harder for us to make progress. Some other things on this report: complete disconnect between discourse and reality. A misunderstanding of facts and reality is dangerous. That's why I bring in those data points so that we can inform our positions and inform our understanding of how to approach risk and look at the not only competencies that we have, competencies that the industry has or doesn't have, and the character, the intent, and the integrity of what we're trying to do. I'll go back to this billboard, and I think that says it all, and I think you can all look at the headlines and the hype that the security industry creates that says the same thing to keep us in that upper right quadrant of my 9 box versus allow us to move to the lower left, which is really where we need to be. You know, having grown up at the heart of the technology industry, straight out of graduate school to Intel Corporation, I've always believed in the hope and the promise of technology to connect and enrich lives, to create economic benefit, to unleash potential. And I am a hopeful person, and I believe technology can do that, and it will do that, but it'll only do that if we solve these risk issues that we have in our environments today and make better choices about how we design, develop, and implement technology and manage it going forward. If we do what I tend to call shift left, meaning move from manual to automated, shift down, meaning move from response to prevention, and then push in, reducing that control friction, we will make sustained progress on the risk curves. And if we do that and have that control philosophy, that control strategy in our organizations, in our investments, in our positions we're taking, we can achieve economic efficiency in security. You know, gravity is going to move you to that upper right, because bad things, you can't eliminate risk. Physically, logically, you can't eliminate it, but we can do a better job of preventing it. We can do a better job of detecting it. And with doing those things in an automated fashion, and hopefully less semi-automated, and certainly eliminate manual as much as possible, we can not only reduce the potential for harm, we can minimize damage to not only our organizations, our customers, our shareholders, but to society, because of the cyber dependence that's growing. Now, this brings me to a concept that I've seen in many organizations, this notion of we have to trade things off. We're pitting the speed of the business against control. We frame it that way, our organizations frame it that way. And I have a different view. I don't think that we have to frame these things as opposed to each other. And I'll explain that as I go through this next section. I think we all probably remember the Ford Pinto, but let me tell you a little bit of the backstories on it that have come out over the years. In 1971, the Ford Pinto was launched. It was Ford's fastest time to creating and building a car ever in their corporate history at the time. They were facing competition in the low-end car market from Volkswagen, and they moved as fast as possible to get this out in order to maintain and as well as grow revenue. Now, I think we all know the story on this. They had some issues that they had found even before they had started shipping the Pinto of potential collisions that could be catastrophic. Now, Lee Iacocca was running the Ford Pinto division at the time. I don't know the man. I wasn't in the organization. This is based upon the research and the studies that I've read. But I don't think Lee Iacocca or Ford were trying to hurt people. but I do think the way in which they framed their decisions led to several years of shipping of the Pinto. They had framed their decisions in the P&L, the financial impact. And I truly don't believe that they were trying to harm people. But I've always looked at risk, in particular information risk, in three ways, under three lenses. What's the risk to the business? What's the risk to the customers? And what's the potential societal risk? Now, I had to do that given I was at the heart of computing and given what my job responsibilities were. But again, from the World Economic Forum report, there's a cyber dependence and society's well-being that is becoming more and more inextricably linked. We are all becoming technology companies and embedding technology into our products and services, which means we all have to start framing the cyber risk decisions, not only from the traditional profit and loss and liability and cost implications, but we have a broader obligation to look at information risk as a corporate social responsibility and start looking at things well beyond just the P&L impact and say, what implication could this have on my customer? What implication could this vulnerability or lack of appropriate control have on society? Ford actually had a patent for a safer gas tank. It would have cost $11 to put it in and avoid the catastrophic issues that harm so many people. But again, the framing of risk wasn't done in a way that elevated the dialogue to something different than just numbers on a spreadsheet. That's what we also have to do. We have to elevate this dialogue in our organizations, looking beyond just the profit and loss side of it. I like to tell stories, and there's another great story around the 1911 South Pole expedition. You had two teams, Amundsen and Scott. Both started out a few days apart from each other, several miles apart in the South Pole, to try and reach that end of the Earth. One team was thought to be the dream team with the funding, the resources, the pedigree that everybody thought would allow them to succeed. And the other team didn't have necessarily the same pedigree, but what they did have was a level of grit. What they did have was a level of discipline. What they did have was a level of understanding that any false move in how they approach this, and they could lose everything. This quote here from Amundsen that I love: "Victory awaits him who has everything in order. Defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take all necessary precautions in time." Amundsen's team was the one that had the less than pedigree. They're the team that got to the South Pole first, planted the pole, and made it back. Scott's team showed up 30-ish days later, only to find that their competitor had planted the flag. And when Scott's team left to make their trek back to their entry point to try and make it home, none of them survived. They all perished. So one team survived and thrived. The other team died in defeat. From the book Great by Choice, they talk about the learnings from Amundsen and his team and this concept they called TenXers. They talk about the fact that they had fanatical discipline. They were productively paranoid. They were creative and they had limitless ambitions. But the big conclusion across all of this is there weren't different circumstances. It was different behaviors, different approaches. And I think we have that same challenge in cyber risk space. We all have the same circumstances, but But those of us that will succeed in managing these risks for our organizations, those of us that will succeed in managing and mitigating the potential societal risks in front of us, it's not going to be different circumstances that allows us to do that. It's going to be different behaviors. And as I tell my kids, you can't talk your way out of something you behaved your way into. You have to behave your way out of it, and that gets to choices that we make, choices that our businesses make, in how we make decisions on these risk issues, as well as the solutions we deploy to try and manage and mitigate these risks. Another story, Formula One. I'm not a race car driver, but I like using Formula One as an analogy. And that's for the simple reason that the business tells us frequently they need speed. They want to move faster, and our controls are getting in the way. Now, that's, again, an issue with us. It's an issue with our business. But the business doesn't need speed. In the United States, the National Transportation Safety Board proves all the time speed kills, and whatever nation state you're in, your equivalent transportation organization, I'm sure, has similar conclusions. What the business needs is velocity. Velocity is speed with direction, speed with purpose, speed with control. And so when you think of a Formula One race and the track and the cars and the drivers and the pit crews, you go, how can they achieve such speed? How can they achieve such real velocity? How do they take such enormous risks but manage and mitigate the vast majority of them? And that's because they've designed everything for speed and safety, which means they get the velocity. The braking system, the car design, the training of the driver, the back spoiler, they are all meant to create cohesion towards the track, cohesion towards the mission and objective. How often are we doing that with our business? Or are we just slopping in controls that get in their way? And again, framing these things as velocity versus control, putting them opposed to each other versus doing the harder work and designing them to work and operate together to do what I say is protect to enable. And then if you think of the pit crew, you know, the people that do the maintenance and operations and enable the driver. And if you think of the driver as your end user or a business process, the car as the PC, the laptop, the device, the application, the track as the network or the internet. And the pit crew ends up then becoming the IT organization, the security team. But the pit crew operates with such discipline and control and communication and collaboration. Again, they're aiding the mission of the driver, not getting in the way of it. Again, it's been designed to achieve the mission objective while doing controls. That's up to us to frame how we approach these things differently. Which means our target needs to be thinking about business velocity and business control. It's a design and architectural issue. It's a mindset that we have to then change our behaviors, because the circumstances are going to remain the same unless we alter them based upon our ability to reinvent, reimagine, reinvigorate what's possible. We've got to do what I call be tuned to target. We've got to understand the market objectives of our organization, what the internal customer needs are and the external customer needs. And instead of trading these things off, it's like a multivariate equation. We've got to optimize the answers for the risk and compliance, for the productivity and user experience, and for the cost and maintenance, not only of the business, but the security solutions themselves. It's an optimization challenge. It's not a trade-off challenge. Now, the reality is, at the end of the day, we might have to make tough choices and to make trade-offs. But if we start with trading things off now, we'll never do the harder work to really figure out how to get information risk and security to be more of an economic efficiency versus an inefficiency. Because if we start with trading things off, we will automatically continue to perpetuate the cause of the economic inefficiency, our approach to information security. Another story, prevention in Panama. This story is about the Panama Canal. Began in the 1800s. The French started building the Panama Canal, and it was just torrential rains averaging hundreds of inches a year that washed away a bunch of the work. The French had believed that they could take on the success that they had with building the Suez Canal and basically replicate it to build the Panama Canal. Again, an architectural issue in the beginning because they tried to build it at sea level like they did the Suez Canal. And with the rain and the runoff, all of that work was washed away. So again, architecturally, they framed it from a prior perspective versus a new perspective. But there were some other things at play here that caused a lot of challenges. Malaria, yellow fever were rampant in the jungles. And the solution, quinine, meant to try and treat the workers because 1/5, 1/6 of the workforce was suffering from malaria on a weekly basis. Imagine the dependence upon the workforce to dig trenches, and 20%, give or take a little bit, can't show up to work. And then they give them quinine, and it left the vast majority of the workers who took quinine deaf. Now imagine I'm a ditch digger and I'm now deaf. What is that going to mean? That means I can't hear orders. That means I can't listen to others, which means I'm likely not doing the right work, and or I'm going to create a safety issue for myself or others because I can't hear that a wall is collapsing. And so therefore I die, or the work that I'm doing causes somebody else to die. Again, think about it from the security side. Are the security solutions we deployed toxic to our business processes, toxic to the user experience? I would submit the answer is yes. Now, if you look further into the timeline of the Panama Canal, early 1900s, Panama declares itself a country. U.S. gains the construction rights. Congress in the U.S. passed the Panama Canal Zone in early 1904, and work began a few years later in 1905. Now, the U.S. architecturally changed it, and they moved to higher elevation, which meant that they had to design differently because they saw what was happening to the French approach. A few years later, the Panama Canal was officially opened. But there's a real story here that really gets to what enabled this beyond just the movement of where the canal was being built, and what was really causing also a significant portion of the problems that stymied and stifled the ability for the canal to get built for decades and decades. Problem? Again, malaria and other diseases that were affecting the workforce. And Major Ross discovered that malaria in late 1903 was transmitted by mosquitoes. They found the root cause of what was causing the workers to get sick. And the conclusions that have happened years and years after this is the control of malaria was vital to the construction of the Panama Canal. It may not have actually ever gotten completed until malaria could be controlled. Colonel Gorgeous and others that were experts in sanitation, after they had found that malaria was spread by mosquitoes, formed a sanitary department for the canal zone. I'll explain what they did. By controlling for malaria, what they were able to achieve was remarkable. They eradicated yellow fever. The death rate dropped in workers from almost 12 per 1,000 to just slightly greater than 1 per 1,000 in a few-year period. And even more broadly across all of Panama, the broad population death rate from these diseases dropped tremendously. They understood the equivalent of my 9-box. They understood that prevention was the true form of minimizing vulnerability and the true potential for harm. And so they got to the heart of the problem and they solved it. Now, it was a semi-automated approach, so it was a little bit costly, but that unleashed economic efficiency that we still see the benefits of today, because the construction of the Panama Canal was made possible only after yellow fever and malaria were controlled, unleashing true economic efficiency for the world. Lessons for security in this: malaria wasn't eliminated. Again, you can't eliminate risk. But because they understood the root cause, the source of the problems, they prevented them. And then the construction was completed that led to a dramatic worldwide social and economic benefit. And going back to the potential in front of us with computing. And we know the root cause of these things, vulnerabilities in technology that need to get prevented up front in the design and the development. And then post-implementation, better technologies, better controls that prevent the risk in an automated fashion with a low degree of control friction. If we do that, we will allow for and unleash the broad societal impacts of computing versus have a growing cyber dependence that puts society at risk. I love this quote from Michelangelo: "The greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but that it's too low when we reach it." As a security industry, as a security community, as practitioners, we've set our aim too low in how we approach these things. And I can tell you, and I think you all know it, we've reached that low. And to some extent, the industry has perpetuated that low and wants us to stay at that low because economically speaking, the vast majority of them have no economic incentive to solve the problem. They profit from our pain, they profit from our insecurity, they profit from our problems. And until we change our behaviors in how we approach these risks and demand more of ourselves, more of our organizations, more of the industry, as well as start framing the risk in different ways and to the potential societal impact and the hope and the promise of what technology can do for us and our organizations, we'll stay stuck in the muck and have a growing perfect storm of risk. We'll end up with CISOs that just accept the equivalent of digital assault on their organizations and the impacts of the shareholders, the customers, and society. I can accept that the attempt to compromise is inevitable. I can accept that people will attempt to get into my organization, but I am never going to roll over. I'm never going to give up. I'm never going to give in to doing my best to manage and mitigate that risk along my control philosophy of the 9-box of controls. If I give up and give in, my organization should fire me. That says I am not suited to do what the organization needs to do. I'm not suited to lead in the way in which we need to lead on these risk issues. And we've also got to make sure that we include privacy as well, up front in the design, not trade off security and privacy. Think of them as two magnets that when turned one way, they're perfectly binding. But if security goes too far, doesn't understand the nuance of privacy, doesn't put in right place and designs to manage and mitigate privacy risks, it's like turning the security magnet opposite. And if privacy stays too academic, too ethereal, and not practical enough in the technologies and what people want and need from technology and what data needs to be gathered and used, it's like turning the two magnets and they polarize each other. And again, a little tongue-in-cheek, but this isn't privacy by design. And for the guys that are out there, you'll know what I mean. This is a design issue. Just like the security is a design issue, it's an architectural challenge. It's a framing of the problem and how do we achieve better, how do we achieve more? Another comment from Martin Luther King that I love: ultimate measure of man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. This is a challenging time in security, in privacy, in the technology we are creating and deploying. We have to know where we're standing. We have to know where we're speaking up, who we're speaking for, and when to speak out on the controversies. We have a controversy in this industry today, and it gets to what I was saying. The industry profits from the insecurity of computing, and we're allowing them to do that. That's a controversy we should all bear arms against and demand more of the industry and demand more of ourselves. And the other controversy internally and challenge we face internally is there's really two battlefields we face: the external battlefield of budgets, bureaucracies, and behaviors, and the internal battlefield, the external battlefield of threat actors and threat agents. We have to take stands on all of these issues to be successful. One last thing for the Edelman Trust Report, with that 2/3 of the world being distrusters, their conclusion is the onus is on business to prove that it's possible to act in the interest of shareholders and society. I think we can. We don't need to oppose these things. It's a leadership moment for us. It's a leadership moment for our businesses, and we have to seize that opportunity. Madeleine Albright, that some of you might remember, she had been the U.S. Secretary to the UN, as well as or ambassador to the UN, as well as the U.S. Secretary of State for a number of years. She had her doability doctrine that she gave a speech at in the 90s in Stockholm, Sweden. And if you think back to that time and why she made these statements, it was a time with the crisis going on in Rwanda. It was a time at what was happening in Bosnia. And her doability doctrine was simple: where our interests are clear and our values are at stake, and we can make a difference, we must act and we must lead. I think we have to have a doability doctrine for cybersecurity. I think we have to change the mindset of accept they're going to get in and have the doability doctrine of my 9-box, where we shift left to more automated solutions, shift down to more prevention, push in to reduce the control friction. Our interest and our business interests are clear in that. That's what they need from us. It is a values and behavior issue and how we frame the risk. We can make a difference. We must act and we must lead in order to change the dynamics that we see today in this industry. If we do these things, computing can be done right. We can reduce risk. We can get economic expansion. We can get societal benefit from the new and emerging technologies, but it's up to us to act and to lead and to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm, for delivering this very insightful presentation. Before moving to the Q&A session, I want to inform you that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 27001 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, and Lead Auditor. A PCB certificate will exemplify your dedication in implementing and managing these processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now we will go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees regarding today's topic. The first question is, what do you think is the main reason that threats and cyber risks are staying ahead of us?
I think it's because of some of the things I've said. We've approached the risk linearly. We haven't deployed solutions that have worked. I mean, you just look at it. The big security companies that have been out there, their stocks go up and almost everybody has their solutions deployed. So the solutions don't work, and then we buy more of the solutions that don't work again, how stupid are we to perpetuate the problem, which we've done. And some of that is because of the buying into the marketing messages, but some of it is because we haven't ourselves demanded better solutions. And so until we demand better solutions, until we have the right control philosophy, and until we stop using technology that doesn't work and put in place better technology, the attackers will have that temporal advantage.
Thank you, Malcolm. And now, because of the time limitation, we'll only answer one more question, and the rest of the questions will be answered by email by Mr. Malcolm. The last questions for today's session is how to increase transparency and rebuild trust after a data breach. Great
question. Again, as I said, you can't eliminate risk, and the breach could occur from, again, a logical attack. It could come from a lost and stolen laptop. Heck, a breach could occur because somebody printed out, a bunch of personal data and then left it in their hotel room before they checked out. So there could be a variety of reasons why a breach occurred. But I think getting to the point on transparency, I think we have to be transparent and say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's what we're trying to do to manage and mitigate the risk. But at the same time, we also have to be transparent internally with the organization on the real state of controls. We have to be transparent on, was it really a sophisticated attack, or was it because our security solutions don't work, our sloppiness of how we manage the environment? That level of real transparency on the state of the state is also necessary. So I think we have to have the transparency internally as well as externally. And to be honest, I think the security industry itself needs to be more transparent on the solutions that don't work. You look at the anti-malware testing stuff, and everybody's showing 100% effectiveness. How could that be? If the testing organizations are saying everybody's 99 to 100% effective, how could that be true if so many breaches are occurring? So again, I think there's probably a less than transparent reality that's out there that we all need to do the right thing, be transparent internally, be transparent with our customers when something goes wrong, and then demand more transparency from the security industry on how they test and how they validate solutions versus what exists today that's more meant to manipulate and confuse than to inform us of the efficacy of control and its efficiency.
Thank you, Malcolm, again for this great presentation, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. Also, please let me inform you that PCB is organizing the PCB Insights Conference, which will take place in Montreal, Canada on November 13th and 14th, which will specialize in anti-bribery and investigation. For more information, visit our website, www.pcb.com. Thank you all and have a great day.